This is
University
Radio Nottingham.
Good afternoon and welcome to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. Joining us today we have Ben.
Hello.
Bea.
Hello.
And for the first time, Ted.
Hello.
Hello, Ted. Thanks for coming on. So, today we'll be talking about Ukraine retaking Kherson. We will be discussing the financial statement that was made a couple of days ago. And we'll be talking about Donald Trump announcing a surprise, I'm sure, to us all, that he is running for president once more in 2024. As always, you can message in the show. If you can find us online on the URN website, do feel free to message through and we will read out some of your questions or statements. We always enjoy reading those. Okay, first of all then, some news in Ukraine. Ukraine have retaken Kherson, and we also had a little bit of a scare. There was a missile fired in Poland, which is a member of NATO, and it was, well, there was an emergency meeting called, and it looked potentially that it could have been from Russia, which would have had serious consequences, because attacking a member state of NATO results in the triggering of Article 5, which is more basically would have meant World War. But luckily for us, not obviously two people died, that's not lucky for them, a missile, it looks like it was an accident and it came from Ukraine. But let's just first of all talk about Kherson, the good news for Ukraine. Rishi Sunak met Zelensky today. What do our panel think? Do you think Ukraine are likely to go further? This Kherson was one of the only major territories that Russia ever took. How likely do you think it is that we'll see Ukraine spreading further into their own territory that Russia currently controls? Ben, we'll start with you.
I think it's great that they've taken Kherson and taken back Kherson, and it does look like the Russians are losing steam, although they've been losing steam for a while. But I think the events this week kind of signify how the war's going as a whole, because you have Ukraine successfully resisting and pushing back against the Russian invasion, which is tremendous, but then you always have this looming threat in the background that the worse Russia does in the war, does that make Putin ever more desperate to push the button?
Do you agree with Ben's assessment there, Ted?
I do, yes, particularly the last point about I'm quietly optimistic, and when I saw the news out of Kherson, obviously I was very happy, but there was a strong part of me which was quite scared of the unknown. It appeared to, I mean, it depends on the news that we're receiving, but it appeared to me to come somewhat out of the blue. And when we're dealing with someone like Putin, who we really don't seem to be able to predict his next move, my first thought really wasn't in celebration, but more of why have they withdrawn from Kherson. It might be a straightforward case, and I hope it's a straightforward case of they were losing it and they had to give it up. But my first thought was more, there must be some darker reason for why they're withdrawing. But hopefully, your first question, yes, hopefully it will be right, that it'll just lead to Ukraine making more gains. But it's been about a week now, something like that, since they retook Kherson, so there doesn't seem to be any sign at the moment of it being a deliberate tactic from Russia.
B, do you think it could be a deliberate tactic by Russia to withdraw, or do you think it is simply that they withdrew because they could not actually afford to continue fighting it because they were losing dramatically?
I mean, I certainly hope it's the second option. We've seen fairly consistently that Russia have not been able to, Putin's expectations sort of going in and getting this clean sweep and finishing a lot sooner than they planned has not kind of been playing out. Like international commentators have said, they've reached resistance that they don't think or didn't plan for to being there. So hopefully that is the result. I mean, it is, as everyone has been saying, like quite a scary thing. Any history student would read that and think that this is the first reason that you see before something bigger carries on. But there's, of course, I think there is looking at the past months of the war, there's certainly evidence to suggest that it is just their inability and their loss rather than a tactic.
Well, let's not forget that Putin has claimed that the Kherson withdrawal was all part of the plan, this ever-changing plan where they never wanted Kyiv, apparently, even though they seemed to be trying to get there for months but failed, but it was all part of Putin's plan, apparently. So I mentioned in the introduction there about Poland, and that was, that came through late at night for us and was a rather worrying move. Luckily, didn't result in the Third World War. But as we can see, when you've got a superpower like Russia invading a country on the border of NATO, this does mean that there is a risk, as we saw, of a Third World War looming. Now, this has been talked about, much discussed since the invasion of Ukraine, which started in February earlier this year. What do you think are the chances of a Third World War? Is this sort of hyperbole, or is this actually something that could end up happening? Bea, what do you think?
I think it's interesting. I think the tendency that we have to classify things as this kind of Third World War as though it would play out in exactly the same way that, or a similar way to the First and Second did, I think that's just unrealistic in this day and age. Things about like nuclear weapons and technology that we have. So I think there is a possibility that there is an increase in involvement with various different countries. And as you said, it's this kind of knife-edge thing where even though Ukrainians are getting victories, there is always that possibility that Russia can act in quite an extreme way. So I think it wouldn't look like the world wars that we sort of look back on in terms of everyone getting conscripted and fighting on different fronts and things. It's much more likely to be sort of in the tech and data space, as well as obviously the constant threat of nuclear weapons. But of course it is a possibility. They are volatile power, and that is never good or safe.
Do you agree with that, Ted?
Yes, I do, and it's for one reason really that I think it is a possibility. Normally, I'm very sceptical of the possibility in modern times or in the future of a Third World War, a nuclear war, if you will. But when it comes to Russia and particularly Putin in this scenario, I am a lot more frightful of the possibility, and it's because the history of diplomacy, and to a greater extent nuclear diplomacy, relies on the assumption that you are dealing with rational actors. There is if we're talking about Putin being rational, then we're not at risk of a Third World War, because Russia feasibly cannot win a Third World War. Nobody can win a Third World War, but especially Russia in this case. So if you were operating under that assumption, you could rule it out, because there's no way Russia would engage in such. But I think there are clear signs, the past year wasn't enough, that we're not dealing with a rational actor in Vladimir Putin, and that significantly raises the risk of him doing something which puts at a threat world peace and risks nuclear war.
And lastly, you, Ben, what do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think that nuclear war is something that could happen?
Oh, absolutely. And I think sometimes history is misread, so I think that assumption of mutually assured destruction, we've come a lot closer to that than I think a lot of people recognise. So when Reagan was in power and the way that story is retold is that Russia was so weak the Soviet Union was so weak by that point they weren't going to risk war. That is really only because of Gorbachev, who was a very conciliatory, rational person. If it had been someone else, that could have very easily ended in disaster. And I think the thing you have to keep in mind with Putin is, I can't imagine Putin saying, "Yep, that was a terrible idea. Should have never invaded Ukraine. Let's all forget about it." Like we are going to have to give him, and we as the West, as NATO, Ukraine supporters, are going to have to give him a ramp off. And figuring out what that is really difficult. But it's a very real possibility, and it's something to keep in the background perhaps when Ukraine is not the top news item, that this could always happen.
So in terms of giving Putin this ramp off that you say, in order for him to call off the invasion, are you speaking in regards to perhaps concessions to Putin? Or what would you provide, or what would you suggest the UK and NATO provide to make it easier for Putin to withdraw?
I mean, short answer is I don't know.
That's fair enough.
I think something that gets floated about a lot is allowing him to officially recognise Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk region, but I don't see how that's going to happen when these atrocious war crimes, as Ukraine retakes this region, are discovered. It's a really difficult job. I don't know what you do, but you're going to have to find a way of doing it.
And of course, Ukraine would say that those regions you mentioned are theirs and should be theirs and were theirs before Russia decided to invade them. What do we think about nuclear weapons then? So we were talking about the risk of destruction, mutually assured destruction, about rational actors. Does this show that nuclear weapons are something that we perhaps shouldn't have, as they can bring such destruction if they're in the hands of people that are not rational, such as Putin? Or is this war actually testament to why we need nuclear weapons? Because if Putin didn't have the threat of destruction from the West, he might have actually invaded other territories that he perhaps has been eyeing up, like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, all of which are NATO members. What do you think, Bea?
I think the problem is that it's not really a question that you can actually put into action, because of course people have them now, and no one's going to say, oh, if you get rid of them, we will as well. Obviously, it does highlight the issues that can happen, but it is a tricky one to say, we should have them, but those who we deem to be not rational are not allowed to have them. How do you measure that, and how do you predict that, particularly with obviously countries where leaders are changing? So I think it's just an impossible question once one person has them.
Ted, what do you think to that?
Well, it's a question of when you said, should we have nuclear powers? Who are we referring to as we? Do we mean we as the global community? In which case, yes, we in that instance should not have nuclear powers. If that was something which was somehow within our possibilities, then we could decide as a global community that we can't have them. But that's not the world we live in. If we interpret we as in the West, well, no, we absolutely have to have them, otherwise we'd be under Putin's thumb right now. And if we manage to, in perpetuity, avoid nuclear war, if we manage to remain in this current situation for centuries to come of possessing nuclear powers but them not ever being used, then they will have actually been a force for good, I believe, because throughout the 20th century we would have had at least a third world war, maybe more world wars, if we had not developed nuclear weapons after 1945. The Cold War only remained cold because of the presence of nuclear weapons. Many wars would have been fought in the meantime. Many more lives would have been lost without both sides, the East and West, possessing the ability to wipe out the other ones. Paradoxical as that is.
Do you agree with Ted and Bea's assessment, Ben, that really, regardless of whether we want nuclear weapons in an ideal world, because they exist, we should keep them?
Us as a country or the West collectively? Who do you mean? Are you talking about?
Either or. Up to you.
I go back and forth on the UK and nuclear disarmament because the amount of money the UK spends on its nuclear system is tremendous. But I understand the counter argument. I think as Anarin Bevan said, for the UK not to have nuclear weapons would send the Foreign Secretary naked into the negotiations. So I understand the argument that we need to keep them as a country, and certainly the West needs them to stand up against countries like Russia. I would think it would be better if they'd never been invented, but I don't agree with Ted's point about that. But no, we do need to have nuclear weapons, and I go back and forth on us as a country having them.
Interesting. Well, we've had a message from someone who I know is an avid disliker of nuclear weapons and a member of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, Sarah Shepherd. Sarah's listening, and Ella, and they've rushed back from the library to listen to this. I hope they're enjoying the show. And someone also said, "Hi, Ted." Don't know who that is, but Ted, you've got a fan out there. Okay, do message in back home if you've got any thoughts on the topic we've just discussed. But we're going to take a short break now, and after what happened in Poland, and we send our condolences, of course, to the families that lost loved ones there. It was a bit of a live and let die situation, so enjoy.
On campus. And online. Check it out. This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to University Radio Nottingham. This is The Big Picture with Felix Hawes, and that was Paul McCartney and the Wings, Live and Let Die, of which Ella says thank you very much for putting it on. Do message in if you have any song requests as well, although I have already scheduled in what we're going to have, and my tenuous links have already been thought of. Okay, our second topic is the financial statement which came out a couple of days ago by the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, and the government has done a complete U-turn from what Liz Truss's government was proposing, with a lot of tax rises and cuts. So let me just run through some of the headlines. The 45p tax rate for additional rate, which was introduced by the David Cameron government, is set to remain after Liz Truss had announced that it was going to be reduced to 40p rate in the pound. But not only is it going to remain, but it's also the extension of the threshold is being lowered, to 125,000 rather than 150,000. Tax-free allowances will be frozen until April 2028. Reforming allowances on unearned income has been done as well, or will be done. Cutting dividend allowances from £2,000 to £1,000. Electric vehicles will no longer be exempt from vehicle excise duty. Stamp duty cuts announced in the mini budget will only remain in place until 2025. The pension triple lock is to remain in place. Windfall tax is to increase from 25 to 35%, though it's important to note the government is not calling it a windfall tax, they're calling it energy profits levy, which is the same thing in any sense, really. And there will be money spent on cracking down on tax avoidance, 2.8 billion. Public spending will be reviewed. That was Felix, that was Daniel, I am sorry. Okay, Daniel is messaging on behalf of Ella in thanking the song. Sorry, I'll go back to... I will go back to what is happening. The defence budget will remain at 2%, though I suppose in real terms that will be cut. Financial aid will not be returning to 0.7%, as it had been introduced under Blair and remain in place until Johnson. It will remain at 0.5%. The government is still committed to the 68% reduction in admissions by 2030. Education there will be an increase to the school budget by 2.3 billion per annum. The NHS will have some 1 billion of new grant funding for social care for the NHS, 1.7 billion for next year. And the former health secretary, interestingly a Labour figure, Patricia Hewitt, has been brought in to advise. Many more things going on as well, but in terms of benefits will be uprated by inflation as well. Minimum wage is going to be raised. I think it's to £10.42p. Price guarantee will continue from April on energy bills at a higher level of £3,000. Obviously, there's a lot here that I'm mentioning. It's also the case, though, in terms of real terms, that a lot of spending cuts will be made, as well as these tax rises that I've mentioned. According to this website, which I'm currently looking at, which is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has said in real terms every department is going to have a cut, with the exception of the Health Service and the Home Office, with the department having the biggest cut, in real terms this is, being the Levelling Up department. So that's an interesting one, particularly as that was one of the main messages of this government. First of all then, Ted, I'm going to go to you. Tax rises on the wealthiest in society, but this is a Conservative government. Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg's previous assertion that Rishi Sunak is a socialist?
I think he's going a bit too far there. I mean, my main takeaway and the main thing I'd say about this autumn statement is it's uninspiring for Conservatives. I think there's a lot of Conservative MPs, backbenchers, that are grudgingly accepting it and sort of going, okay. The tax rises. Yeah, this is supposed to be a Conservative government. This isn't what Conservatives believe in. So does that make Rishi Sunak a socialist? I mean, the way in which he's done them, I'm not happy about the rise in corporation tax. I think that's very unconservative policy.
19 to 25%.
Yeah. I think we had it set, I can't remember the exact figures, but I think when it's around 15% under May, that could be completely wrong. I'm sure if Daniel's listening, he'll correct me on that. I think we had it set nicely there, where our revenue from corporation tax was actually in a sort of Goldilocks zone, where we were keeping corporations in this country and keeping them paying tax, because it was at a nice level where it was cheaper than some other countries, but not too low that we weren't getting any revenue at all, and we seem to have forgotten that. The sort of the top rate of income tax, it's not particularly conservative, but it's not something I'm going to lose sleep over, really. It's probably not going to make that much of a difference to the whole budget, it's something I wouldn't want to do, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm not actually overly upset about.
B, do you think that Rishi Sunak is a socialist?
I do not. I don't think is it possible to have his level of wealth and be a socialist? I don't think so. There's kind of a fundamental disconnect with the idea of socialism there. Yeah.
Fair enough. Do you have any more wider thoughts on the budget? I mean, this is a mixture really of the Cameroon austerity years, but also there are some more left of centre ideas here, like the raising of tax on the wealthy, though what is considered wealthy is being lowered, which I think Labour have criticised. But also with the minimum wages being increased, triple lock on pensions is remaining in place. There's going to be help for energy to the poorest in society, and I think actually quite a lot of people can claim that. So what do you make of this sort of mixed bag budget?
I think it's interesting. I'm sure Labour are sort of thinking that they wish they could have introduced some of these policies, including the windfall tax, I think, as well, is part of that, which they certainly at one point were sort of saying they wanted to introduce. I do also think, though, that it's interesting the sort of creeping reduction in help. You know, for example, the energy cap does exist, but it's also risen to a higher amount as well. And also the certain kind of more classically conservative things of the banker's bonus cap, you know, has been lifted, and that has remained. And also the lack of cracking down on non-dom status, which I believe a Labour MP sort of quipped that was due to the fact that the Chancellor could not get that past the Prime Minister's wife.
Who, of course, has a non-dom status.
Yes, yeah. Of course, yeah. So I think there's certainly interesting elements of, as I said, policies that Labour wish they could kind of have been the ones to introduce. However, they've definitely still not fully tackled this cost of living crisis. And the sort of pay rises essentially just mean you go into a higher rate of tax due to inflation, which basically just reduces people's spending power, and obviously increased council tax as well. So I don't think it is effectively tackling the struggles that people are having, particularly with like energy bills at the moment.
Ben, do you have anything more to add on the budget in the wider scope of things?
I think it's gone down slightly better than the last Tory budget.
Yes, I think Rishi Sunak's probably not going to have to resign anytime soon.
No, I don't know.
Well, I think the reason why you've seen quite a muted response from the Tory right is because they had their chance to run the place last time, and it did not go swimmingly. And so they've been effectively, I think, shut up for that. And you have Jacob Rees-Mogg, but he's really on the fringe now. So I think my main issue is with the presentation of the budget. I think with the budget, I mean, you have to. Some form of austerity is probably necessary, sadly. I'm glad that's taking the form of tax raises more than public expenditure cuts, although in real terms there are still cuts to public services. But my main issue is there is no mention of the mini-budget disaster, which is not responsible singularly for the state we're in, but it's certainly a big part of it. And there's also still no mention of Brexit. I mean, you were talking about business being discouraged by raising corporate taxes. I think it's more the mini-budget and leaving the single biggest trading bloc and refusing to reopen the can of worms. And something that has slipped out, I know it's because I'm a law student, is every EU law that we adopted in our time in the EU is set to sunset in 2023, at the end of 2023, according to a bill that's currently going through the stages in Parliament. So if it's my issues with the presentation of the bill, because there's no acknowledgement of what 12 years of this lot have done for business investment in this country. So my issues with the presentation of it, I think, more than the substance of it.
To come back on some of the points you said there, yeah, I think it's 35 billion of tax rises and 20 billion cuts, I think. In relation to Brexit, how do you come back to that with saying that actually quite a lot of members of the Eurozone are also going to enter a recession? In fact, a third of the world is going to enter a recession according to forecasts. How has that got to do with Brexit when clearly we're the only country that actually has left the European Union?
Oh no, on the point of business investment.
Right, okay, yeah, fair enough.
Ted was saying that raising the corporate tax rate discourages businesses investing. I think the chaos of what Brexit has done to our economy and to our status as a trading power is much more significant in that respect, and it doesn't get mentioned.
Of course, Ireland, though in the European Union, has a corporation tax rate of 13%, and it is the country expected to grow the most, I think, in all of Europe. Of course, the UK and the G7 is the only country expected to decrease from, I think, 0.2% decrease in growth, which, of course, is what Liz Truss was really hoping to achieve, though didn't quite manage it. In fact, there was a poll done, I cannot remember by which polling company, I apologise for that, which showed the British public do blame the Liz Truss budget the most for the issue that we are in. So it's very difficult for the Conservatives to recover. They did rise in the polls following Liz Truss's office, but they're still sort of now stuck at about the 27% margin, which is lower than what Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got in 2019, when of course they got the lowest seat shares since 1935 for that party. So it's not looking great for the Conservatives. But what would Labour do? Well, Labour have really only come up with two policies. Labour have acknowledged that there is a 55 billion black hole, which the OBR has forecast, which is something Liz Truss didn't acknowledge. So Labour are now respecting the OBR's forecasts. The fringes of both the left and the right are not big fans of the OBR, but Labour have accepted this, so they need to also fill in this black hole. So we know what the Conservatives are going to do, whether we like it or not. They're going to, as I said, raise taxes to fill 35 billion of that and make cuts for the other 20 billion. Labour have come up with two policies that we know of. One is to abolish non-dom status. This is estimated to raise about 3 billion, and they also are hoping to raise VAT on independent schools, which is expected to raise 1.8 billion. Now, both of these things could have additional consequences, but ignoring that for now, that's only 4.8 billion of the 55 billion that the Labour Party need to fill if they were to come into government, which looks increasingly likely in 2024 or 2025. What else could Labour do, actually? And are you surprised that Labour haven't really announced many other policies? Or do you think perhaps it's not actually necessary for them to do so as they are in opposition? What do you think, Bea?
I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, as you say, they are in opposition. And to expect them to kind of come up with an entire economic policy that's going to fill this black hole, as it's been phrased, which has not been addressed by the people that are even in government, is a slightly interesting way of looking at the situation. I think obviously politically they have got sort of significant amounts of informal power in that, as was mentioned earlier. There's who can the Conservatives blame for this other than Truss and the previous 12 years? You go back to sort of 2010, they can blame Labour and the financial crash. So I think politically they're in quite a strong position, and I do think they would benefit from putting up more of a front of different economic policies and explaining what they would do if they were into power. However, I don't think that they can be expected to sort of solve this fairly impossible economic situation that was not even created by them whilst in opposition.
What would you do, Ben? What would you advise Labour to do to fill this 55 billion black hole?
Well, I think another thing we haven't pledged to and won't is scrapping the triple lock on pensions. I think that is a ridiculous idea when it was brought in, and it's something that the Tory party rightly recognised they couldn't scrap without confirming their election defeat at the next election. But the triple lock means we spend an enormous amount on pensions, and when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, elderly people are substantially better off than younger people in today's economy. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. There are plenty of old people who are in real poverty, but as a general trend, you have to look at how you can make the cuts and the prudence that needs to follow affect those with the broader shoulders. And at the moment, I think it is elderly people who have the money, so I think the triple lock has to go.
I think it's a quarter of pensioners are millionaires, to put that into perspective. Ted,
Yeah.
you're not a Labour man.
No.
Are you feeling concerned by Labour's economic policies, or are you sort of relieved that they haven't seemed to don't seem to have many?
Well, I think they correctly realise that they can't solve it, and that's one thing I agree with that Jeremy Hunt is talking about, this idea that we simply cannot fix this problem as a national government. It's more of a problem is Labour's rhetoric trying to suggest that there is things that can be done to almost completely solve the cost of living crisis, when we know that there isn't. I'd much more appreciate it if the Rachel Reeves and the Labour front bench would recognise and outwardly say that, and then put forward policies which can help in some way, even if they're not going to solve it. But I think a sort of, as all oppositions do, to be honest, it's not just the current Labour Party. They're trying to suggest that they've got this hidden golden ticket that can solve anything, and the Tory government is somehow not realising it, when really they don't have any major ideas. There'll be a few things. I mean, I'll agree with Ben on both the policies actually that they have put forward. Non-dom status is a relic of the empire that has no place in the modern world. I don't know why it still exists, whether it is because of Mr. Sunak's wife. And the triple locks, I mean, it's clear why they still exist, but it'd be a huge way of saving money for the government. And yeah, I think you said a quarter of millionaires. I think it's something also like there are more pensioners that are millionaires than are below the poverty line. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with wealth in my opinion, but when by and large this subsection of society have their own wealth, there is no reason why the state should be continuing to fund their lifestyle when we're in the crisis that we're in.
Perhaps it's the fact that old people are guaranteed voter base for a party that is declining massively for the young. It's interesting actually with the non-dom status. I believe that Margaret Thatcher's government considered abolishing it in the late 1980s, thinking that by reducing the additional rate of tax from 98% to 40%, that the non-dom status was no longer necessary. I did see a statistic, again, I'm afraid I can't cite my sources and I can't remember the exact figures, but it did show that the standard of living next year is going to, the decrease in standard of living next year is going to be the largest in living memory for most people. So it's going to be tough times ahead. We're going to take another break. Do message in. This is a reminder that you can on the website for your opinions or statements, and we'll read them out. But yes, we've had the financial statement and a lot of talk about money.
This is
University
Radio Nottingham.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture live on University Radio Nottingham. Our third and final topic is Donald Trump has announced that he is running for US President in 2024. Surprise, surprise. This is following the midterms, which we discussed last week, where the Republicans have now reclaimed the House of Representatives, but did not manage to reclaim the Senate, as it was reported they might be able to do. In fact, they dramatically underperformed, and many Republicans in the establishment are blaming Donald Trump, who had already sort of announced that he was going to make this announcement before he made the announcement. So therefore, he couldn't really pull out. But the Republican establishment are not entirely happy about this. There's been a lot of quiet from his big supporters, and the Republican Party is sort of splitting on it. There's already talks that the chosen Republican representative to be the Speaker of the House, that was Nancy Pelosi's former job, it looks like some of the Trump supporters aren't going to back him, so there could be a split there in terms of who actually will be the Speaker. Also, Washington Post, which is one of the leading Rupert Murdoch magazines.
New York Post.
Sorry?
You mean the New York Post?
What did I say?
Washington Post.
Oh, is it the New York Post? Sorry. Yeah, go on. Thank you. Thank you, Ben. The New York Post. Sorry, that's the New York Post. When Donald Trump announced that he was running, it claimed Florida man makes an announcement at the bottom of their page. They also previously called him something like Humpty Dumpty, but with a Trump twist. And also Fox News, another Murdoch-owned news outlet, interrupted Trump's speech and before he'd finished to move on to something else. So they are moving against him. But as we discussed last week, the Republican establishment didn't like Trump back in 2016 when they supported Jeb Bush, another governor of Florida, and Jeb Bush did not get the nomination. Obviously, Trump did. And this time it looks like another Florida governor could be going for it, Ron DeSantis, who of course took Florida with a 20-point lead. Compare that to the rest of the country, it's quite extortionate. Now, what do we think? Do we think that the Republicans are going to turn on Trump? Things are different to 2016, of course, because now he's actually been in office, and statistics show that actually for candidates that Trump backed, they decreased the Republican vote share by about 3%. Candidates that Trump did not back increased their vote share by, on average, 5%. So there is a correlation there. Or do you think Trump is an unstoppable force who is still in the membership, still love him, the average rank and file Republican, and therefore anyone that goes against Trump will just be obliterated? And so, yeah, what do we think to this announcement? Ben, were you surprised?
Actually, I was surprised he announced this early, because it's a very long time before the election. It's like the usual time to get in the race is May, June time of the year before the election. That's when the primaries usually get started. So I'm surprised he's announced so early, but what really shocked me was his speech had none of the magnetism of Trump's usual speeches. I mean, I'm no Trump fan, but he does have this ability to grab your attention. But his speech on Tuesday was just this, I think it was like an hour and a half, an hour long. He was just quietly rambling to it. It's like a mix between all of the charisma of a Joe Biden speech with all of the departure from reality of a Donald Trump speech. It was a bizarre thing. I think he will still go on to win. I just think he's hooked the Republican base, and I think an interesting way to see that is people who have their seats guaranteed in the Senate or in the House, like Mitt Romney or Mitch McConnell, are comfortable going against Trump. And people in the media are comfortable going against Trump, but your average Republican elected politician is terrified to say anything bad about him because they know that their voters will have them out if they do. And I was listening to Ted Cruz's podcast, and he was blaming anything but Trump for the poor performance in the midterms. And then I remembered that the last time Ted Cruz had gone against Trump, Trump had insulted his wife and suggested that his dad murdered JFK.
Classic sort of Donald Trump put-downs, which are sort of, this is the thing that anyone would struggle if they went against him, including Ron DeSantis, as sort of the only real person, I suppose, that could actually take the nomination off him. B, what do you think to this? Do you think that Trump is likely to be the nomination for the Republican Party, or do you think actually Ron DeSantis might go for it and actually has a shot of winning against him?
I think there is a possibility he could. The problem is the sort of cult-like worshipping of Trump just means that any other person who goes against him is almost seen to go against his ideals, when actually their beliefs line up or professed beliefs line up in a lot of ways, which is quite an interesting dichotomy. I just think Trump has this kind of more cult-like figurehead personality that DeSantis doesn't have yet. Maybe next election cycle possibly. And also I just think whilst there is some hope that perhaps his time in office would mean that people would think that he is not fit to run the country. I think there is the possibility that that can be turned around, and he'll claim that all of the good things that happened were down to his amazing charisma and political skills, and all of the bad things had nothing to do with him. And he has the uncanny ability to do that. So I do really think he does have a shot at it, certainly, particularly as there doesn't seem to be at the moment any sort of other Republican candidate who seems to have a shot against him. Perhaps that changes as the election cycle continues, but at the moment he is looking like he has a shot.
Ted, do you agree with Bea's assessment there that really there is no one at the moment that could challenge Trump and be successful, including Ron DeSantis, who, again, I would say, bucked the trend and did a very good job of increasing his vote share for the Republican Party in Florida in the midterms last week? What do you think?
It's on a knife edge, but I don't personally think Trump will get the nomination. I think it probably will be DeSantis.
Interesting.
I'm personally hopeful that Nikki Haley stands up at some point. But whether she's really got a chance, if DeSantis has a chance. But I think Ben talked about the sort of the fear. The established politicians in the Republican Party have never really been big fans of Trump until they saw the effect it would have on their own electoral capabilities. Go right back to 2016. Ted Cruz was no fan of Donald Trump, and then it seemed like I'd missed something. I woke up one day and he was
grown a beard
biggest.
and was singing his praises.
Yeah. But I think the midterms really showed that it has to be DeSantis if they want to win. There was a clear rejection across the country of Trumpism. People are not fans of Joe Biden. I've not met anybody who is an actual fan of Joe Biden. There are people who would vote for him over alternatives, but nobody actually is in love with his presidency. And I think you put up a candidate like DeSantis, they can win easily. I think there has to be an appetite within the GOP to move on from Trump. They can kill him off here. If he fails to get the nomination in 2024, that's it. And that will be it.
Or what if he runs as an independent against the Republicans and the Democrats?
Well,
do you think that's a possibility?
Possibly.
I mean, that would split the vote, of course, and allow the Democrats to win.
Yeah.
Which Trump has said that Trump has actually said that in the past, that he knows that would happen. And so it would be out of spite, I suppose, to the Republicans.
Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't do anything out of spite.
Doesn't sound like him, does it?
Doesn't sound like him.
No, Trump could be the Teddy Roosevelt of the 21st century.
He could. Bull Moose could be back. But I think, I mean, that's one thing which could mean they do nominate him.
Yes, I suppose if he threatens that he's going to do this, regardless, he's going to run under the Republican banner or indeed by himself, that might push people to say, look, well, I suppose then our best chance of winning actually is to keep him on board, particularly when about a third of Republicans say that they are more loyal to him than they are to the party. And therefore, we at least a third of the Republicans, which is in turn a sixth of the US electorate, would vote for Trump, at least.
I think we do sort of overstate the levels to which he himself has great support. He has his hardcore fan base, but I think really if you look at it on a national scale, especially by 2024, I think it'll be not as significant as we're imagining it will be. There is a hardcore section dedicated to him, but I think a lot of people will just want something, a right of centre alternative to Joe Biden. I think that's clearly Ron DeSantis or anyone. But DeSantis bucking the trend in Florida really sets him up nicely. I was actually surprised. I think we've been expecting since a couple of weeks before the midterms that Trump would declare his candidacy now. I personally thought after the results of the midterms that he'd be delaying it and really considering whether he would do, because it was a clear rejection of him.
If you were DeSantis, would you run? Looking at the polls, DeSantis is polling higher than Trump in Florida, Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa and New Hampshire being key battleground states in the primaries because they are often done first. Do you think he is going to run? And also, let's not forget about the establishment. That is a huge force to fight against. Trump did win before, but now there's a sort of an electoral record behind him that doesn't look as positive as I mentioned. And it's also the case that the likes of Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens, two quite big names of the Republican media, are now no longer backing Trump. What do you think to that? Do you think DeSantis would be foolish not to run? Or do you think actually he knows that if he goes against Trump, he's likely to lose, despite what the polls are saying, and actually if he wants to be president, he's better to let Trump go for it, take the Republican nomination, then lose again to Biden, and that will open up a better chance for him to run in 2028. What do you think, Bea?
I think, well, personally I'd like him not to run because I think he has a better chance of winning against the Democrats further down the line. But I do agree that I think he would be foolish not to run, at least to put the challenge up, because he does offer the Republican Party a better standing at the national election. And also, he seems to have more competency than Trump in terms of the campaign. The amount of blunders that Trump ends up committing is always just kind of countless, and I appreciate that they generally just get sort of missed by his base. But I think there's the real potential that DeSantis gets, backing of Republican figures and perhaps even people who supported Trump because the alternative was obviously, there was no viable alternative in the Republican Party, would switch that to support DeSantis, and therefore he might have a real chance of winning. So I think it'd be foolish not to.
Ted?
I think he would be very foolish not to run, because I don't think history will be kind to the Trump Republican Party, and if Trump wins and beats DeSantis, I think he can sit back and go, okay, well I tried, and then I think that's a perfectly reasonable and will be a beneficial platform for him in 28, 32. The guy's very young, DeSantis. He's got ages ahead
42,
of him.
isn't he?
Yeah.
I think.
Something like that. He's very young, and we look at Joe Biden running for president in the 80s.
Yeah.
He's got ages ahead, and I think he can set himself up for the future. Whether it's the next election, the one after that, or the one after that, it'll be really beneficial for him to say to the country, perhaps not the Republican Party, but to say to the country that he was a conservative who was trying to keep Trump out of office. I think it'll be really beneficial instead of being seen as an appeaser, which I think history will see any of those conservatives like Ted Cruz, those that know, and we know that they know, deep down, Trump will not be healthy for the country and has not been healthy for the country or the party. If DeSantis can capitalise on that in the future, he will set himself up well. I think it'd be very foolish not to run, even if he's to lose. I think he almost benefits just as much from losing as he would from winning the nomination.
I don't agree with that. I think DeSantis has a very difficult few months ahead because unlike Trump, DeSantis actually has a job. He is the governor of his state, and Trump... maybe Trump has changed and is going to conduct a inspiring, positive campaign in the next 6 months, but I have my doubts. And
I wonder why.
And if he goes on a tirade about Ron DeSantis is really in a pickle because what happened in 2016 was all of these candidates who were being sort of these ridiculous insults from Trump. You either ignored them, which made you look weak, or you responded, and the only real way you can respond to that is by going down to their level, which makes you look pathetic. So I think he's in a really difficult situation now because he has to actually run a state. He has to... I suppose he has to find a way of responding to Trump's attacks if they come, which I suspect they will, without either looking weak or looking like he's going down to Trump's level. He's in a really difficult spot. And the other thing about DeSantis is he's not a very charming guy. I think he's a very savvy political operator, but when you actually see him on a stage, he just comes across like an angry Florida man. And I think the Republicans have much better candidates. You mentioned Nikki Haley. I think she'd be I don't like her. I wouldn't vote for any Republican, but I think she's a fantastic candidate. I think Glenn Youngkin doesn't get talked about enough. I think there are Republicans who they should run. I think DeSantis is in real trouble, and I think having the establishment on your side is not actually a positive thing for a Republican because the Republican Party membership hate the Republican establishment. People like Mitch McConnell,
yes,
who have delivered tremendous success for them, are despised by the Republican membership because they think I guess they still have that sense of Reaganism that anything that stinks too much of government is probably part of some deep state conspiracy. So I think he's in a really difficult spot.
Trump has also, of course, already started dishing out his insults. I think he called Mitch McConnell an old bat. Ron DeSantis.
Is he wrong?
Ron DeSantis is Ron DeSanctimonious. And he's also called Glenn Young Kim, and has referred to the fact that it sounds Chinese.
Yeah, he also made a racist jibe about Mitch McConnell's wife, I believe.
To be fair, Mitch McConnell did then vote against interracial marriage, so I'm not sure he
I'm
entirely
not.
disagrees with Trump anyway.
Yes, it's a very interesting and nasty affairs, and I'm sure it will continue. Of course, Ron DeSantis hasn't really commented at all on Trump and the wider Republican debate on who should be the next leader and why they didn't do quite as well in the midterms as they previously thought. Now, that is all we've got time for today. Thank you very much to our regular listeners, Ella, Sarah and Daniel, my parents, George Scotland's aunt, and maybe the Beeston gang if they're listening as well. Thank you very much to Ben, Ted and Bea for coming on. I've been Felix Hawes. This has been The Big Picture. Just before I play our last song, we had a comment from someone at home saying, up the climate, we hate global warming. So thank you, good message, and goodbye. And Donald Trump, if he's running, will be trying to canvass as much support as he can. I suppose he will be surfing USA.